Hello, and thank you for joining us for our Scenario Planning Masterclass. I'm Michelle Sacker, Chief Operating Officer at Fuld Company. Today, we'll guide you step by step to using our Scenario Planning Toolkit. We'll show you how to identify key drivers of change, build actionable scenarios, and develop strategies to stay ahead in rapidly evolving markets. To bring this to life, we'll use real-world examples so you can see exactly how the toolkit works in practice. I'm delighted to be joined by Fuld's Chief Knowledge Officer, Mike Ratcliffe. With over 3 decades of experience in strategy and competitive intelligence, Mike has delivered scenario planning workshops across industries, including healthcare, insurance, engineering, and food and consumer goods. He is also the author of the Scenario Planning Toolkit. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the webinar. And as a reminder, the session is being recorded and we'll share the recording with you afterwards for you to refer back to. Let's get started. Over to you, Mike.
Many thanks, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Scenario planning was pioneered by Shell in the late 1960s, or some 60 years ago, and it's shown itself to be a very powerful tool for navigating uncertainties, allowing companies to think about a range of futures or scenarios. So fast forward to today, our businesses face disruption across nearly every market, yet many organizations remain overly focused on short-term issues, overlooking the long-term dynamics that can disrupt and reshape their entire industries. Now, scenario planning allows you to develop a number of diverse future worlds or scenarios, some of which will have high probability of occurring and others significantly less so, while some might be wildcards or potential unexpected major disruptions. Each based on a different set of assumptions or drivers, these allow you to create strategies to mitigate potential threats, as well as take advantage of potential opportunities through a structured process. One of the key benefits of scenario planning is that it helps you to find a limited number of drivers of future change out of a huge number of potential forces that could impact your market, and so this gives you focus. Another great strength of scenarios is that it helps companies think about how they might be able to shape the future to their advantage. Whole campaigns of influencing key bodies can be developed and deployed if the goals have been clearly thought out in advance through a tool like scenarios. And clearly, scenarios allow you to get a group of your diverse experts within your firm to come together to share their knowledge and come to an agreement on how the future might evolve in their marketplace and what the risks and opportunities might be for your company. It's very common for experts to become siloed inside a firm today and not see the bigger picture. Workshops help overcome this issue. We actually see the same benefit when we run war games. As Yogi Berra, that famous baseball player and coach, said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So be prepared for the fact that it's not a simple task developing scenarios, and that you and your team need time to work through each of the steps of the process, allowing you to question and review your findings each time. And lastly, scenarios allow you to find what are the key drivers you need to track and allow you to set up a monitoring system through a formal structure and monitor in which direction your target market seems to be moving relative to your scenarios.
Great. Let's get started. I assume that the first task in scenario planning is to make sure that you have clearly defined the goals of your project. Otherwise, you will be wasting time considering forces and future worlds that are not relevant to you. Or alternatively, you might be too narrow in your view and miss some critical force and the potential for a major disruption.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Make sure you clearly set your goals out from the start. And once this is done, you identify the drivers of change in your marketplace. And these are all the forces that are likely to reshape the future of your market. And you need to go through a process of narrowing these down to a limited number of drivers, which will ensure that you're focusing on what really matters and hence allow you to create scenarios.
So I know we've used the pastel model in different workshops. This is a great model to help identify the external forces to any market, the drivers of change with letters P standing for politics, E for economics, S for social, T for technology, E for environmental, and L for legal. Mike, could you share an example of how you use the pastel model to help identify forces that might impact future scenarios?
Absolutely. Pastel assures that you don't overlook any of the major external markets that could shape the future of your market. I use these types of models as checkboxes to make sure that I've gone through each of the key areas I need to look at. So for sake of today's exercise, let's say that we're developing scenarios for the US automotive market and its likelihood of moving away from internal combustion engines or ICE to electronic vehicles or EVs. So using the pastel model, we'll find that each of these 6 concepts has one or more forces that are very relevant to the dynamics of this marketplace. So for instance, let's start with political forces that could come into play. And let's say that the federal government could provide lump sum subsidies for new purchases of EVs, or states could provide tax benefits, lower tolls on state highways, or even give free parking at city meters. So these are all examples of political forces, and to be honest, that's exactly what the Norwegians have done. So this is not theoretical, it's actually, we see these forces already. Let's go to finance. Financing of either an ICE or an EV vehicle is clearly going to be an economic factor, especially if the difference between these technologies narrows in the future, or EVs could even get cheaper. So cost of financing is really important. A social factor could be range concern. This is actually a big factor today, with consumers really worried about whether they might run out of battery power in their EV before the next charging station. And so many of them have been reluctant to buy EVs and are sticking with buying hybrids instead, which have both gasoline and electric power. So if range concern goes away, that might also mean that there's going to be much more demand for EVs. Battery technology is, I think, clearly critical for EVs, as improvements in price, energy storage ability, speed of charging, and holding a charge in cold weather could all impact the cost of EVs and eliminate range concern. So better battery technology is going to be much more impacting the demand for EVs. Environmental, reducing emissions is a key environmental force, with international, national, and even local pressure to eliminate greenhouse gases from its tailpipe emissions. And while legal forces might actually be set for state or city controls over the deployment of a totally different type of technology, that of autonomous driving, where computers, not humans, are in control. This technology is known as full self-driving, or FSD technology, and it's highly controversial today, with the potential to allow cars to be driving in all conditions by computers. And clearly, if that were to become the norm, that would radically change the marketplace.
Great. Thank you for demonstrating how pastel helps identify key external forces to any market. Let's also think about forces internal to a market. An ideal model for this is Porter's 5 forces. Here, this model makes you review the 5 forces of the suppliers, the customers, substitutes, new entrants, and companies within the market itself, or the rivals. This model could be especially valuable as it would force you to look for new entrants who all too often bring leading-edge technology and innovation to disrupt markets, sometimes with catastrophic effects for the incumbents.
Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. A great model. Porter's model is invaluable, and again, one of these what I call checkboxes. Traditional ICE market in both the USA and Europe's under major threat from cheap Chinese EVs entering and swamping their markets and sending them into major financial crises as they try to match what the Chinese are doing and switch from ICE to EV technology. One of the reasons why this could happen is that China already has a near monopoly over battery technology. So If we go to Porter's model, we can see that China could be a major influence of supply with its near monopoly over battery manufacturing. It could also be a potential disruptor of new entrants as competitors of the Chinese manufacturers to existing rivals, which are US or European companies, could come in with their growing ability to export cheap EVs into the US marketplace. And if China keeps on developing cheaper and more efficient batteries and uses them in their models, which they're going to export to the USA, it could also have an impact on the consumer issue of range concern, and so influence buyers of new passenger cars and make them look for EVs rather than hybrids. So traditional strategy markets actually have a very difficult time helping companies think through all of these ranges of different futures in their marketplaces, especially when some of them could be major disruptions. So I think what we'll see is scenarios help you by forcing you to think about each one of these major scenario, different futures, as potential new worlds and what might be the disruptions.
Great. So now we've gone through and have some examples of how we've identified forces both external and internal to a market that could impact future scenarios. How do you start to handle all this complexity and put into a format that can be modeled and used strategically?
So, as I said earlier, develop a list of all the key forces that are likely to impact your market. Now, this could actually be quite a long list. Don't worry about that. It could be 80 to 100 forces, doesn't matter. What you need to do at this stage is to think outside the box as you compile that and make sure you've got all of these forces down. Then next you need to go through this list and start the narrowing process of getting it down to those forces that are going to have a potential of changing the direction of your market relative to your goals. For instance, if you take the recent results of the US presidential election, and given Trump's close relationship with Elon Musk, clearly you've got to go include government funds providing subsidies to EVs as a potential force, and also Chinese suppliers of batteries being impacted by import restrictions. So you can see that you've got all of these different forces that you need to think about. But however, on the other hand, you could have things like automotive financing as an important driver of overall demand. But if interest rates are going to be the same for both ICE and EV and hybrids, the cost of financing should be taken off the list, as it's not going to be a driver of change. Maybe have some uncertainty about it, but it's not going to have the ability to drive the car market into different futures. So it's very useful to go through this process, building up the initial list and then methodically cutting it down through a workshop with all of your key experts to make sure that you've tapped into as many new ideas as possible and understand whether they're really important to your goals. And then after you've gone through this process, you're likely to end up with a list of, say, 30 to 40 key forces, which, because we've now seen them important to our scenario process, let's call them drivers of change rather than just forces. And that will allow us to actually redefine what we're looking at.
Terrific. But before we move on, Mike, could you explain to our audience what the columns to the right signify where it says poles A and B?
Right. So each driver is going to have two extreme poles. Remember, we've picked these drivers as being ones that can change your marketplace. So what we do with the poles is we look for their extreme future states. And the extreme future state is really going to allow us to think outside the box and think about what these future scenarios might do.
So perhaps you could give us an example in the passenger car market again that you've been using.
Sure. Let's take a look at two of the forces that I've implied are already enough to be called drivers: substitutes for EVs and Chinese imports. So let's take a look at what happens when we combine these different poles, and we can start then to go and see how different future worlds are emerging. So let's assume that our subsidies driver has the two poles of no subsidies and major subsidies. We could define that later what that means, but just let's keep that as a simple concept for the moment. Whilst our Chinese import driver has the two poles of no imports and ban through excessive tariffs. So let's start by taking a look at the case of no subsidies, or pole A for the subsidies driver, and no import restrictions, or pole A for our Chinese imports driver. When you take a look at this, we see a world where Chinese imports could swamp the US marketplace, as there are no barriers to cheap imports, and this would probably result in a rapid demise of the US passenger car market sector, with the possible exception of Tesla. So that would not be a good scenario for the US market, but it's potentially quite a realistic scenario. If we now go and change the pole for Chinese imports from pole A to pole B, so it now becomes Chinese imports becomes blocked, we see a protectionist world in the USA, but no assistance to the US manufacturers compete with their expensive EVs against their existing ICE market. Again, all within the US market. This situation could be especially bad for the US car manufacturers trying to develop an EV market, as this ban of imports could also impact the supply of Chinese batteries. So because of this issue around the supply of batteries through these different poles, we could consider this as a possible rather than a probable future world. Now, if you go to the substitutes driver and switch that from pole A to B, so now it's allowing major federal subsidies, we can have the Chinese imports driver at pole A and no restrictions. And what happens then? Well, we see a world where Chinese competitors are even worse than we had before for the US car manufacturers, as now Chinese has open access to the marketplace. Plus, they could also benefit from all these federal EV subsidies, assuming that this funding isn't car manufacturer specific. So this really is not a good scenario for the US car manufacturing market. Lastly, if we keep subsidies on pole B, but major federal subsidies, and move the Chinese imports from A to pole B, such that Chinese imports now become banned, we see a world where the US market is subsidized and protected and could be good for the US domestic market, but US manufacturers have serious competition internationally, and this lack of competition domestically might result in them being vulnerable internationally, where Chinese competition is still around and they will force prices down. And so US manufacturers have a slow death, as they can't survive internationally, they can only survive domestically. So I hope you can see how a combination of drivers and poles, when you really think about them, lead to very different potential worlds.
Yes, definitely. Now I understand the importance of creating the two poles for each driver. But at this point in the process, we may still have a list of 30 to 40 or even more drivers, each of which could influence some key element of the automotive market, and each of which has two poles. So that's a lot of complexity. How do we go from here still to scenarios?
Right, so we haven't finished culling down these forces and whittling them down to the key ones. So we need to now go to a step of selecting 4 or potentially 5 key drivers that are going to have the greatest possibility of radically changing your marketplace. These top 4 or 5 drivers form the foundation of your scenarios, and we're going to call these critical drivers of change. And then when you have an agreed number of scenarios, then you'll be able to go and write them up with a detailed description, and each can also be named. Again, this next process is also part art and science. So I suggest what you need is a reviewing team, which let's say you call your scenario team. This team needs to go through the process of reviewing your list of 30 to 40 drivers one by one and asking the question, which ones have the greatest ability to radically create a new world in my target market? And the criteria that you need to use are the potential impact of any force to change the market and the uncertainty around whether this is going to happen. So as you go down the list, you'll immediately find some of these combinations stand out as major importance, and other ones you're going to have to challenge and talk about in terms of just how important they potentially could be. So accept that this is going to be an iterative process for your scenario team to go down these 45, to go and get down to 4 to 5 critical drivers of change.
So, how exactly do you prioritize drivers when there are so many possibilities? Could you walk us through some of that decision-making process?
Right, so I said that the core part of this overall process is to evaluate each potential driver's potential on impact and uncertainty. Drivers with the power to upend the market, combined with their high degree of uncertainty, are going to be prime candidates for creating a new scenario. Now, you may recall that we identified battery technology when we were going through the Pestel model. Well, let's take a think about this. It's likely to have a massive impact on the future of the market in terms of its performance. So to really make the EV market the dominant technology in the passenger car market in the USA, battery technology has to improve around price, capacity to hold electricity, speed of recharge, and potentially some other characteristics. Now we know that there's massive R&D going into batteries, and hopefully battery developers will overcome all of these key issues, but there's still significant uncertainty as to when they will do this, whether they will do all of these different factors, and so whether it really will happen. So as a result, with battery technology having great impact and also great uncertainty, it's likely to be one of those critical drivers of change that we would encompass in the various with various improvements in price and performance, with its polls ranging from no advance from today as one of the bases, and the other extreme being, let's say, 50% improvement in cost and price performance. And again, you can assess exactly how much that maximum could be, but let's say it's just 50%. So these polls would cover both impact and uncertainty and create this range of possibilities.
Got it. So, for the sake of this exercise, let's assume that we've gone through this process and you've already identified the 4 or 5 critical drivers of change. Now that we've got them, can you help me understand how we go from having this limited number of critical drivers of change to actually creating scenarios?
Okay, so let's assume that we have 4, not 5, 4 critical drivers of change that we have identified for the US passenger car market. And let's assume these are subsidies, battery technology, China competition, and self-driving technology. So let's take a look at what might be the next steps of defining scenarios from these critical drivers, and accept that again, it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science, because you need to go and really think outside the box to understand how these might come together. But to help you, it's really useful to use what we call the scenario matrix. And what the scenario matrix allows you to do is to think about the different combinations of your drivers and your poles. So we can populate this with our 4 critical drivers of change, and each of them has 2 poles. And so 4 drivers, 2 poles give you combinations of 16 different driver poles. And you'll see this in the slide. In the slide, we just show 4, but you can see that you could actually have all 16 with X's in one or either of the high-low boxes. Now let's examine each of these 16 drivers to interpret what it actually means in terms of a future world. So let me take you through some examples. Some of these combinations will not be logical. For instance, if you have no development for the pole for battery technology, it doesn't make sense when you combine this with total national adoption for full self-driving technology, as you're going to need improvements in batteries to be an essential prerequisite of widespread adoption of FSD technology. So this is going to allow you, as you think about this, to eliminate some of these drivers because they're not going to be logical. And then the remaining combinations need to be examined one by one to examine what the potential future of this world is likely to lead to. Having gone through all the remaining combinations, we now can map these into different potential future worlds and so create our scenarios. So let's say that the four passenger car markets processes in four different scenarios. So I'm really jumping ahead and saying, let's say that we've gone through this process and let's take a think about these four different potential opportunities of combining. So one of them might be, for instance, a national US EV manufacturing market protected by subsidies and import barriers. Now, this could be very good for US manufacturers domestically, but as I said before, this world could actually limit their ability to go and access Chinese battery technology, and that could mean that they're not going to be competitive internationally, and also they wouldn't have FSD. So when you think about these combinations, you start to go and create this realistic world that's got all of these dimensions to it. Now, another scenario could be a market where Chinese imports totally swamp the US domestic manufacturers with EVs and their batteries. There's going to be no import restrictions and no subsidies, which also might mean that Chinese will also export or try to export their FSD technology to the USA. And this world would most likely cause very early death of traditional US auto manufacturing if they can't come up with their own technology to compete with the Chinese EVs. A third very different world would actually be where FSD gets adopted totally across the USA because of the potential benefits to society in terms of safety and accident reduction. Now, interestingly, this would not need subsidies or blocking of Chinese technology. Because if you think about this, FSD could actually protect the US manufacturing market itself, as there would most likely be federal mandates that no Chinese EVs could have SSD, because we don't want that data be passed back to Beijing. So effectively blocking the Chinese competition. So this particular world creates a very interesting situation, which could be very good for the US manufacturers. Now, a fourth world could be a bridge world where it's holding back the market to EVs because of range concern, and that's going to continue to allow US manufacturers to exploit hybrid technology, which they've already got, and that's going to allow the hybrids to compete with the EVs. And so they're going to remain competitive until it may be that EV technology continues to advance. And in one of the later scenarios could take over because battery technology has eventually developed to the stage where EVs are going to be much cheaper than hybrids. So that's another world, but may not be the final world, but it could be what I call a bridge world.
This is great. So now you've actually shown us four base scenarios or four potential worlds, but I don't think we're done. How do we take this forward once we've developed these scenarios?
Right. So what we need is the story behind all of these potential scenarios to be worked up in detail with as much color about what they potentially could look like. And this we can help do by mapping the polls to all of those 30 to 40 drivers that still we have got in our back pocket into these four potential scenarios to make sure that one, everything is logical, and when considering all these different drivers of change, how they will map in there. So let me give you an example, for instance. One of the critical drivers of change that we haven't talked about, that hasn't come up, could be, for instance, concerns over data security. I think you could see just how important this could be with basically cars today being computers on four wheels. And we could have two poles of weak data security or very strong data security as our two extremes. So, as I say, with so much computing going on in passenger cars today, this really is a very important issue, as weak security could allow hacking of data or even third parties taking over control of an FSD car. And this would imply that weak data security could be one of the reasons why FSD is not approved, but strong data security, on the other hand, could be a prerequisite of why FSD technology should be approved. So including this driver in the narrative around FSD would give it valuable color to this scenario and insights into the opportunity of actually developing new security services if your company believes that FSD is likely to go mainstream. So you can see how this scenario actually creates opportunities and threats. When complete, what we can also do is we map all of these full 30 to 40 scenarios in terms of allowing us to go and give as much color as possible behind each scenario when we write up its narrative. We also need to name scenarios. This will actually help encapsulate their essence into our colleagues. For instance, we could have our 4 scenarios named as Stronghold USA, where we've got all of these important and supportive subsidies, or Chinese takeover, where the Chinese come in and swamp the US marketplace, or autonomous autos, where FSD is the key technology, or hybrids survive if we still got this bridge technology still in play. And it's also very useful to depict these scenarios visually through a diagram or a map. And this should try to indicate which scenarios come first, which later, and if different scenarios are linked together. For instance, the hybrid world would be considered as a bridge, as I said earlier. So what we could see is that would come earlier in the map, and it would get linked into those full EV worlds, which later battery technology advances would actually bring those into potential existence.
Okay, super. So you've created the scenarios that we've demonstrated. There are 4 worlds as part of our example, and the detail of how those original 30 to 40 forces are still parts of the scenarios that you have now defined and named. At this point, you could probably start thinking about your own company's strategies in relation to these potential future scenarios. Could you share an example of how you would do that?
Right, so you need to go back and you've got your scenario team, and you need to go and actually review each of the scenarios. So what you should do is get your team to separately go through each scenario, make sure that you're happy with it, and understand what the potential risks and opportunities are from that scenario for your firm relative to your goals. And then once you've identified these, the results are reviewed collectively to pinpoint what we call critical success factors that cut across all the scenarios. And these should form your core strategies for your company's prime focus, because this will mean that these will be good strategies regardless of which market evolves. And for those factors that are unique to specific scenarios, you need to develop contingent strategies that will only get implemented if you see these particular strategies starting to evolve and they starting to materialize through your tracking.
Okay, so there will be core strategies and contingent strategies. So I noticed from your examples in the passenger car market that electricity power occurs in all of the 4 scenarios. So would developing strategies to exploit this be an example of a cross-cutting core strategy? And if so, what might a contingent strategy look like?
Yeah, right. So even in the scenario where this hybrid technology continues, electricity remains as a power source. It's not as important as those scenarios with full EV technology, but even so, if your company's, let's say, not involved in EVs, but it is in the power sector, you consider what strategies you could develop to make sure that you're taking advantage of supply electricity into the auto market in any situation. Our contingent strategy might be, for instance, getting involved in our FSD technology, especially if you see that this would seem to be a key strategy which would allow the continuation of the US auto manufacturer and stop it getting attacked and destroyed by Chinese competition. So that could be a really good contingent strategy for you to think about and to monitor FSD technology and see whether that's evolving. Final bit of the puzzle is actually to set up that monitoring system, what we call an early warning system, or EWS, to monitor how your scenarios are unfolding. And this is going to involve defining specific indicators that you think are signals that suggest your market is moving in one direction or another. And in today's digital landscape, there are lots of AI-based computer tools that can streamline this monitoring system for you Then you need to analyze the data and provide regular updates on your market's direction. And so by tracking these indicators, your scenario team can identify emerging forces early, adjust their strategies necessary, if necessary, revisit scenarios. Don't view scenarios as cast in stone. They're flexible. So if you see new forces evolving, go back and revisit your scenarios if necessary.
I think that's really, really important advice. And a lot of, we know a lot of companies have early warning systems. We're not spending a lot of time on it here, but I think that's something to consider. And as you said, be flexible with what you're evaluating when you're setting up an early warning system. So you talk about indicators and leveraging AI. What kind of indicators would you recommend a business start tracking? And how exactly can AI make this process more efficient?
Well, we've already got our indicators. They're the 30 to 40 critical drivers of change that we've already defined. And these are going to provide the ideal list of search and monitoring terms. However, be very careful. AI and computer-based monitoring can be really good for tracking some of these drivers, but may not be ideal solution for all of them because some of that technology may not be in the published domain and computers may not be able to go and pick it up. So take a think about what you need to track. And if some are really important, you may need to go and set up specialized monitoring systems to track this by using some of the other technologies that we use, like primary research of talking to people in the marketplace to really understand what's happening. So, in summary, scenario planning really is a very powerful tool to future proof your future business. By structuring tools and using these like PESTEL and Porter-sized forces, you can develop high value scenarios. You can also then apply your existing strategy processes to evaluate what you should be looking at and how you should consider to ensure that you're not going to be caught off guard by sudden disruptions in your core markets.
Well, Mike, this has been a fantastic walkthrough for what is an extremely complex process. And I thought I should say, for those just starting out, evaluating and trying their hand at scenario planning, what's the most important first step they should take to get scenario planning right?
Well, think out the box, take a look into the future, and see if your core market is likely to be disrupted by and potentially transformed in the next 20 to 30 years as a first step. To be honest, the likely probability is the answer is going to be yes. Then you need to talk to your management about we really need to consider a scenario planning process to capture what might happen to our marketplace to make sure that we really have got these things as part of our overall strategy. So I hope this helps.
Absolutely. And I'm sure many of you are already thinking about how this could apply to your own businesses and industries and select markets. So we do now have some time for questions. Please feel free to share your thoughts or questions or comments, and you can type your questions into the chat, and I will then read them out for Mike. But I'm going to ask the first question. That's my prerogative. To get us started, Mike, we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've really you've done a great job sort of helping us understand the process from identifying drivers to building scenarios and then defining strategies. In your experience working with clients on these scenario planning exercises, what is the biggest challenge that businesses face when implementing scenario planning, and how can they overcome it?
Well, I think, as I said before, many companies are very focused on the short term, especially with all of these computerized search services being available. So the biggest challenge to get companies to think about scenarios is really to make sure that they not only focus on the short term, but also on the longer term and realize that they can set up a process that's manageable to go and allow them to take a look at the uncertainties that they see in their future and build those into their strategy process. And you know, many managers may not sort of get that. So I think part of the issue is overcoming the internal barriers of making sure that people realize that is a process to do it, it is manageable, and it is also extremely valuable.
Excellent. Very good. So I do have a question here. It's come in. You talked about external forces like regulations or technology when we were looking at Pestel, the Pestel framework, how they can reshape industries. How would you recommend businesses prioritize which external factors to focus on, especially when resources are limited and especially when you're not sure exactly what's going to happen when administrations change? So, how do you handle this?
Well, as I say, set up a scenario team. Your team's really going to understand your marketplace in a way that us as consultants don't understand. Very deep understanding. When we talk to clients, we actually see that. And they should be the ones that review what's most important in terms of these forces and to focus on the ones that are really important for your company. And it could be that, again, because there's a lot of uncertainty, that it's difficult to go and say which is more important than the other one. But often you can start to see that, but your team will really have that understanding of how different forces can impact their ability to reshape themselves in terms of creating opportunities and mitigate strength, mitigate weaknesses and risks in the marketplace.
Right. So be comprehensive, certainly, to understand what the forces could be. As you said, think out of the box, use frameworks, but at the same time, leverage your knowledge to understand what might be most relevant for your industry. Okay, terrific. Now, I see another question here where the question that's come in said, oftentimes scenario planning involves making assumptions about the future. That's exactly right. So, how do you ensure that the scenarios remain practical and relevant as the market evolves?
Well, as I said, you need to review the whole process on a regular basis, and you will see that. Well, what we're talking about are forces that are uncertain. So it could easily be that a new force is suddenly going to appear that you hadn't thought about or we hadn't seen relevant in the past. So this, as I think I did say, scenario planning is not something that's set in stone. It's got to remain flexible. Probably you need to review the thing, say, every year. May not be, you don't have to go do it every quarter. You need to read out what's happening on a quarterly basis, but you
Okay.
can, as you go through that process, you'll start to see things evolve. And if you see new forces evolving, then they should be built into the next round of scenario planning and your next view of what those future worlds should be. That's what Shell does. Shell still, over 60 years, is running their scenario process every year.
That is really helpful, and also to remind you to think about it's not over and done with, and how to keep it alive by having these regular quarterly readouts and then to review annually. Okay, that is a very helpful understanding of how this process continues. So naturally, I have a question that's come in about AI. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how AI-based tools can enhance the early warning system? And are there any specific tools or approaches that you'd recommend for businesses just starting out?
Yeah, I could get a bit technical on this, but there are a number of computer-based search services that are already available. They use machine language, they use large language models to go and actually pull the data in, and then they potentially can use machine learning or ML to actually identify what direction that or that's that particular bit of information means to the client. So if you use these different tools of large language models and machine learning, you can actually build an early warning system. The machine learning piece actually is the one, when it's trained properly, it can allow you to predefine what direction any activity you see in a driver is going in terms of which direction of the two poles. Is this activity going in pole A or pole B? And you can actually get the computer to help you with this. So, we do this for our clients, and we have the service of automatically allowing you to go and use AI to help you set up these drivers effectively hands off, so it can actually take a look at what's been happening in the marketplace. It can populate each driver a box for each driver and which pole it's going to. So AI can really be very, very valuable and set up this whole process. Of course, once you set the process up, the cost of running this is not that great. You have to review it every
Right.
year, but the cost isn't fantastic.
Right. It's the first upfront
Yeah.
effort that, yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So I have a few more questions that are coming in, and keep them coming. In your experience in looking at the scenario matrix template, 16 rows, after eliminating the illogical rows, how many are usually left? They're just wondering how hard would it be to get down to the most important of those 16 potential sort of permutation combinations.
Well, if you think about it, each combination basically is going to have four rows of two poles, right?
Mhm.
Or sorry, two drivers with specific poles that are illogical. So each one of those is going to be four. You might find out of your 16, you're going to go and see two combinations that are not sensible. So it gets you down to eight that are likely. So you've still got eight to go through, but that's going to give you a lot of color and ability to think about those. And sometimes I think if you think about what I was describing earlier, some of these different combinations are sort of slightly different views on really the same type of potential
Mhm.
future world. So you can combine these together to create sort of the
Mm.
limited 4 to 5 different key drivers. So it's not, as I say, it's not a science. It's not something like we use these the matrix and that's it. It is one where you have to look at them and review them and see whether they're logical. Are they highly probable or less probable? And can we combine these together to really understand what are the key drivers?
Right. I have another question that might be similar. This is a question of, I think, more the science than the art part of it. Does thinking through the probability of the scenarios or drivers occurring come into play in a formal way in this process? Like, do you assign sort of actual probabilities?
Of course, you're talking to an ex-physicist, which is what I did in college. So don't talk to me about probabilities. No, be very careful about probabilities because I know that a lot of scenarios, when you take a look at a lot of published papers, they have the probability of this world happening is going to be 80% or 60%, and this probability of this one's going to be 40%. So this means the remaining 20% is going to be on this particular world. That can be very useful, but it can also be a little bit distracting. You can think about the probability. If you look at the different forces in your probability, you can come up with some idea of whether they're more probable or less probable. I'd much prefer to go and use terms like that than it's 60% probable rather than 40% probable. I've said in the past that I can actually predict any marketplace in terms of its value to 100%. The problem is that when I come to timing, I'm always 100% wrong. You can't predict marketplaces that well. But if you think about it in sort of value, uh, qualitative terms rather than quantitative, I think that's
Mm.
actually a lot more valuable.
So I have a really interesting question here, which is really goes to sort of company culture. This question says, "This would be a new way of thinking for my company." Have you found that leaders are mostly open to this way of thinking, strategizing? And what kind of pushback should we be prepared for? It's a great question.
It's a great question because I think a lot of managers don't understand this. So they're just going to say, "Hey, I don't understand. I don't get it." So you have to go through a process of selling it to them. And hopefully, I
Mm,
give you some examples of what you can do in terms of selling to them. Think about it like this: what we're doing is we're creating these very different worlds that, sort of in mathematical terms, are orthogonal. They're different worlds. You're trying to make
mm,
them different. So you think about the world in this way or in this way and think through what might be the implications. That's a very different way of thinking about marketplaces relative to some of the typical strategy work that's done. So it's not easy. I agree with that. But if you want to, call me up. I'll get on the phone and I'll help try to sell it for you.
Great advice. I totally agree. I feel like some of what we're talking about here is what you said before. It's timing. So strategic planning, typically people might have one and we got some comments back saying, that's amazing. Thank you. So good. So I think, the timing is an interesting point. Oftentimes we run workshops. Scenario planning is really thinking out towards the future, right? Like the 3 or 5 plus, like 5 to 7. Strategic planning often is more short term, like in 1 to 3. And I think that has a lot to do with why this might be challenging for culturally for leaders to think about it when there's so much pressure for them to think more about the short term. That's just commentary for me. I have another question that's come in the meanwhile. Do you recommend using all 4 of the top AI softwares? This is an interesting question, to compare their outputs to each other, given that all AI software have errors in their outputs. I mean, we are really in a time right now, right, Mike, with Gen AI and the hallucinations and what's actually valuable. And I think the AI that we think about when we think about Gen AI and the technologies out there, it might be very different from what you are talking about when you're talking about setting up AI systems to follow indicators. Is that right, Mike? I mean, do I have that
Yeah,
right?
I'm a great believer in garbage in, garbage out. I think that things like Gen AI are really great, but when you take a look at what ChatGPT churns out, if that's what you're talking about, 80% is right, 20% may not be. So be very careful. You need to go and have warm bodies involved in this. So use AI tools as a tool, not as an
Mhm.
output, because all of this there's a lot of subjective thought that's got to go into this. As I said, a lot of it is qualitative, not quantitative. So
Mm.
AI tools can be really valuable because you can actually use AI tools to go and take a look at the pastel forces, right? You could go onto
Mm.
ChatGPT and say, give me all the pastel forces that are going to impact my marketplace. And it'll give you a great list. That's a fantastic start, right? So that will overcome a lot of the grunt work that you've got to do to start thinking about forces. But that's only a tool. You then got to
Mm.
go through this process of saying, is what the computer's given me right? And it may well actually give you some ideas that you hadn't thought about. But it can be very valuable, but it's not the end. You need that human warm body involved as well.
Excellent. Thanks, by the way, for the question. Great question. Great answer. I have a couple more questions here. I think we still have time for them. So there's a question about in the process when defining drivers and their poles. How do you balance between being specific enough to take action while not overly narrowing the scope of possible futures? That's a real process question, I think.
Yeah, the poles should be extreme. So it's actually
Mm.
relatively easy to go and set the poles because you look at some of those extremes might be if you've got something like battery technology where you know that in which direction it's going, it's not likely to go back and become worse unless
Right.
there's, unless there are issues around supply of lithium or something like that. So that could actually be the case. If
Mm.
lithium suddenly become really restricted, you couldn't get, or some other rare metal for batteries wasn't available, then it actually could go the other direction. So that's what you need to think about when setting the poles. So you're really only worried about setting the extremes, not setting where you are today. Because what you then do is you look at the direction when you're monitoring of is it going in this direction or that direction. So again, it's not a quantitative set, it's qualitative. And that's going to allow you to take a think of is the market moving in this direction, not by probability, but just moving in this direction rather than in another direction. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. The direction is critical. I have one question here, and I think this is going to be our last given the timing. In your experience, what is the biggest pitfall organizations encounter when implementing scenario planning, and how can they avoid it?
Um, I think I think it's actually um, ignoring the possibility of major disruptions. Hopefully, what scenario planning is going to do is to change the mindset of your organization so people really do understand that you could have a major disruption in the future and you need to be able to go and plan for that. You know, we can go back into history and we can look at so many marketplaces that have got totally disrupted because the key players did not accept it. Um, you know, I've actually blogged relatively recently about the US car market and the analogy with the shipping market is where actually I started when I came out of college. I got into the oil industry and then shipping. And the whole of the European shipbuilding market ended up in Japan because the unions would not accept change. So actually getting change and getting people to understand that may not purely be inside your company. It may be outside as well. And I think we're seeing that today in the car market, where the unions in the major manufacturing companies in both Germany or the Europe and the US are starting to go and put up barriers. So that when that happens, you've got to think, how can I overcome that? So the issues may not be internally, they could be externally, and it may be your job to try and change that through some process.
Absolutely. And keep being on top of all of those different forces that are popping up there, I would say, which is why scenario planning is always important. I think that's all we have time for. I'm looking at the time here. I would like to say, first of all, if you haven't already done so, please do download our early warning toolkit, our scenario planning toolkit. I think we're going to share a QR code. There it is. And I want to thank Mike for sharing some brilliant insights on scenario planning. Thank you also to our attendees for joining us, but also asking some very stimulating questions. We will send you a link to the replay of today's session. And if you have other ideas for other instructional videos or webinars that could be helpful for you, please do let us know. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.